driving on the right side of the road is like fantastic, unless you think it's like morally inherent. And then, oh, well, in Thailand, my experience was almost dying in Canada because I took a turn into the wrong lane because I'd just come back from Thailand. And
Yeah.
then it's the other way around where I almost died because I was used to it the other way. So it's like, it's really hard at that, the habituation goes deep.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are consequences for violating it. Um, when it's somebody else's habituation doesn't match with yours. So the concept of social construction comes out of phenomenology. And when phenomenology is combined with sociological methodology, it becomes what's called ethnomethodology, which it sort of came from people trying to do field work with interviews, and the interview subjects, I mean, you couldn't take for granted that what they had to say was authentically, objectively true because it was based in their belief and their observation. And their belief and their observation wasn't based in objective reality, it was based in their understanding of the situation. And particularly when you're dealing with certain people, because a lot of this work came out of like criminal studies and drug studies and things like that. The view of reality that the people had under these conditions was different from the view of reality that the average person has. Obviously, especially if they're involved in organized crime. And people, I mean, we're fascinated with things like organized crime and that kind of thing. And then we sort of like touch on what we think that world might be like. And there's a lot of work out there that shows how off that is. But there's a quote from Alfred Schutz, who was one of these people, one of these ethnomethodologists, who said, "Reality is socially constructed rather than out there to observe. Even in research, we cannot take for granted the world the subject sees or claims to see is real." Um, so what we find out when we start taking this on board and saying, okay, so people are seeing the world differently than it is, or people see the world, they think they see it as it is, but it's not, it's mutually exclusive to somebody else's view that they have to deal with at some point. Then reality is a transconscious, interpersonal, and systemic series of shared epistemological agreements. And that's sort of how I wanted to write it out, which means we see the world consciously and unconsciously, the way that it is taught, communicated, and run. But it's sort of silly to assume that we would have an objective view of the world because we're not physicists, and physicists aren't psychologists, and psychologists aren't architects. Why would we need all of these people in our society in order for our society to function the way it does, to specialize in these knowledges, if there wasn't something like that, if there wasn't a limitation on the ability to know all of the things? And so since you only ever have part of the picture, the puzzle's made up of several smaller pictures put together. That's how civilization functions. It's required for civilization for us to be able to do this, for us to be able to compartmentalize our knowledge into pieces. But with that, we also have to take into consideration that that means we aren't seeing every piece of the puzzle. Maybe we get a glimpse of the big picture, but our piece of that puzzle is very small compared to the whole.
Read the quote though, really quick, because it was a mouthful and I liked it.
Our reality is a transconscious, interpersonal, and systemic series of shared epistemological agreements.
Right, and those are conscious or unconscious, or or both.
Well, yeah, in fact, that's the next thing I have in my notes actually, is to explain exactly what you just said. The socially constructed reality can be thought of being made of three parts. The unconscious or non-rational part, which is normative. That's not to say irrational, by the way. That happens sometimes. People think, what, our society's rational? Yeah, but that's not what I mean. I mean that some of the building blocks of it you don't think consciously about, like all the stuff that starts to become routine. Then there's a human exchange, rationality, communicatory part, where people police each other's behaviors, children are punished, laws exist. There are systems in place where these agreements have become codifying and visible. But those two things intertwine and become possible to begin with because of the third, which is basically language. Language creates the possibility for the unconscious parts to be internalized and for the parts that are agreed upon, the rational parts, to be communicated. And they're sort of built by the language, because the language is how these things wind up being interpreted. And then the practice of these things affects and creates the use of the language. So it becomes a cycle. The unconscious part supplies the language, which constructs culture and then law, which normalizes into the unconscious parts, and then over and over, forever and ever, which is why language changes over time and why laws have to be interpreted. There's a lot of weird ideas on the right in particular about how law has this sort of weird unchanging eternity to it, whereas the Supreme Court exists because laws have to continuously be reassessed again and again. We have to interpret them differently than the way that they were interpreted when they were originally written. And that's part of like the founding principles behind the construction of the law in this country, for example. I want to talk about like the book itself for a minute, but it's sort of based on the history of anthropology as a lens for examples. Most of the book is basically examples of what they mean. And there's loads and loads of different versions of these examples. And some of them are even, what I like about the book is that some of them are even a little tongue-in-cheek. Like they visit the idea of racist preconceptions and post-colonial thought. Like there's a thought experiment about a white man building a raft, building a matchstick raft, who is happened upon by a Papuan. And it's like, well, this white person with their background in the English language is already familiar with Robinson Crusoe, and they're going to immediately slide into the Man Friday mode of thought. This Papuan might not have ever been predisposed to this idea and would have no concept of what this other person's mindset already comes from. And so this winds up being something where very clearly they have different interpretations of the reality that they're engaging in, because one of them has this background, the other one doesn't. They aren't communicating about that. They don't have to, in order for us to see that they're different. And then there are other things about, and we were talking about identity, and where identity comes into this sort of thing is during that internalization process. And what we recognize in the phenomenological experience of encountering others. And one of the examples they have in the book of this, which is also really funny, although I can't think of a way to set it up. Hopefully it'll just work. But the author says, so there's my friend Henry, and I understand my friend Henry as a researcher and as an Englishman. And there are things I know about researchers that come into that thought process, and things I know about Englishmen that come into that process. But even though I know all of these things about Englishmen, particularly through experiences with my friend Henry, that does not mean that I know anything about experiences with the Queen of England. And then the Queen of England becomes a kind of running gag for a while, where the Queen of England is suddenly an example of things that, you know, we do or do not have experience of, because not very many people hang out with the Queen. So there's this non-scientific view of reality held by a gestalt of the masses. That's chapter 7.
Yeah. So when you say gestalt of the masses, right? When I think of a gestalt, I think of foreground and background and how they are interdependent. What do you mean by gestalt of the mass?
Gestalt of the masses is like the religious aspect that leads to the witch burning and stuff like that, where they don't necessarily need a scientific view of their world. What they need is a functional view of their world. And that's basically what most people have. Okay. And so when that becomes reified on a massive scale, you start to see some really weird shit begin to happen.
So one of the things, though, that you had just talked about was, reification, reify. That those are words used a lot by critical theorists and sociologists. So do you want to break down reification? What is that?
Yeah, they have a section in Berger and Luckman, which was probably the best. But basically, that really helped me to understand it in a new way, which is basically that the things that we believe as an individual, as a society, become real when we enact those things, and other people continue to make it real when they continue to act on said beliefs. And then there are consequences for the beliefs that become as real within reality as many objective things do, because breaking the law gets you arrested, for example. There are consequences for the things that we have decided we agree upon as a society, or even as an individual. Honor killings would be another example of this, in the extreme, of course, but extreme examples are usually the most stark. So you can point it and say that's the sort of thing we're talking about.
Right.
They reify their beliefs when the action upon their beliefs become an objective part of reality.
Right. So one good example of that, I'll be using gender a lot here. So the gender dichotomy, not even the binary, the dichotomy where the two are like not, they're completely separate and opposed to one another, is reified every time we assume the gender of a person who appears a certain way, right? Oh, he, him, she, her, because they appear to what meet these criteria, but like because that's the only two that are being used all the time to divide people up, the very that very heuristic is sort of naturalized, right? We take something that's seen as normal, and then and then we think that it goes as deep as we think it goes as deep as biology, when obviously biology is a lot more messy.
Yeah. Yeah. So some of what we're talking about with that, people having to react to the normative structure. There are tools we use in sociology to that end. One of my favorites are were generally referred to as breaching experiments, which were developed by Harold Garfinkel. And what Garfinkel was trying to do as an ethnomethodologist was to get people to sort of break open these societal black boxes we have, where there's unspoken parts of reality that we can't really investigate sociologically because people don't talk about it. And so I use some of those in my own studies with like the Dungeons and Dragons players. I have to try to find ways of getting them to talk about parts of the experience they don't normally discuss. And then we do that in ethnography as well. When we're interviewing research subjects, we have to find ways of getting them to give us information about how they see the world. But how most people see the world winds up being so internalized that it's not rationalistic enough for them to explain it. So you have to figure out how to get them to put it into a rational space so they can communicate it to you. And sometimes that requires undermining their view of reality a little bit. And one of Garfinkel's most notorious experiments was a linguistic experiment in which he told people to how to respond to "How are you?" When somebody would say "How are you?" and this is, I mean, this was in the 60s and 70s, I think. So the societal picture is a little different because you might get people saying silly things now, but the response to "How are you?" is sort of a set of pre-programmed concepts. You say "Fine, how are you?" because that's what you're supposed to do as part of the linguistic exercise of exchange. So he had his students respond with something like, "Do you mean how am I medically, or do you mean how am I emotionally?" And the response in my textbook is, "I don't actually care how you are." Because they weren't even asking the question, "How are you?" out of politeness. They were asking the question, "How are you?" out of this pre-programmed notion of participating within their society appropriately, not even nicely. They're not even trying to be nice. This isn't a nice guy. He doesn't care how you are, and says as much to your face in the conversation when you ask if in response to this question. And I do this by accident sometimes too, because I have a hard time with things being literal. And so like an example that I have written here is like if I say something like, "Well, that was pretty stupid," and then somebody says, "Why do you think they're stupid?" Now, my immediate response isn't, I didn't mean they're stupid. I mean what they were doing was stupid, or the situation. It's a question of clarification. The first thing I think is, do you mean what makes me think it, or do you mean what caused the stupidity?
Okay.
And I'll start, deconstructing the conversation that we're already having to try to discern meaning from them when they think that their meaning should be clear. Because the linguistic pattern behind it isn't mathematical. It isn't code. It's not something that has an appropriate logical response. It is something that somebody has crafted into a means of communication that is external to themselves when it leaves and becomes internalized by the individual experiencing it. And so they say something to me, I hear what they say. They had to encode what they were thinking into the language, speak the language. I heard it, and I had to decipher it in my head. There's a lot that can go wrong in that process. The rules people assume are not necessarily the same as the ones we codify. And that's something that happens with this, because you think if I say the right thing in the right way, the right thing will happen. Like self-help books and leadership books are written with that presumption in mind. But there's so many more steps to that, and there's so much involved in the social construction with the view of reality that has to be shared in order for any of the communication to take place meaningfully. And even then, it can take place in a functional way without the world of the plumber and the world of the electrician becoming one world. Although there definitely overlaps. There's no socially constructed reality that is in a vacuum. It overlaps with the way that the different groups wind up interacting.
Could you take a stab at defining breaching in a sentence?
Yeah, you have to break the normativity in some way. In fact, sometimes they'll do things that should enact mores. There was they discuss Milgram in the textbook at this point as another example of breaching. Yes, the Milgram experiment was definitely breaching. Another example of this of breaching stuff was a researcher, Earl Baby. They sent students to clean up trash in the park, and the reaction that people had to the students picking up trash in the park was in many cases shocking to the students, because they felt like these people were doing something that was outside of the realm of expected behavior. Just cleaning up the park was breaching the habitus of the people in the park. What the people in the park considered normal was broken by somebody doing this. And as I recall, and this story might be apocryphal, I'm not certain, one of the students was threatened with police charges for impersonating an official by pretending to work for the parks department when they were picking up garbage when it wasn't their job. Like this is the sort of thing that can happen when you are breaking what we take for granted as being normal. But the rules people assume are not necessarily the same as the ones we codify, because it's not illegal to pick up trash in the park, right? But everybody knows it's wrong. And this was what wound up coming out of that process. How do you get to the stage of the codification from the socially constructed reality, the normal? How do you get from the normal to, what it is you need to try to accomplish?
I feel like I almost just want to let you just run through everything you have here, because it's really good. But I do want to say for the people who have newly entered that on the one hand, we're talking about socially constructed reality. On the other, there's a book by that name that Lampay's like kind of giving us cliff notes of, which is awesome because I've now read a third of that book. And if you can have a favorite book without finishing it, then like it's already up there for me, because basically I just wish I'd read it, at the beginning of my journey, not at this.
Me too.
Really what it does, a lot of the insights that were really hard-won insights wrestling with some obscure and obtuse people such as Heidegger are unpacked in very straightforward ways in this text. So there's my plug for it.
Yeah, no, it really is great for stuff. I mean, any time you're going to be trying to look at any of the social dialectics, it helps to have this in the background. Like I remember going back over what I knew about Nietzsche and being like, it's so much sort of smoother when you think about the way that people have to make decisions about what the world is like in order to, in order to act upon them. And then things like gay science kind of make more sense, because you're like, well, yeah, the socially constructed view of reality for the people in the Judeo or in the Greco-Roman culture and the Judeo-Christian culture are remarkably different. You're still there, right?
Yeah, we're
That was just a moment of panic.